Please be aware, you'll see in the screen that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website for people to view after the event. This means that anything we discuss in the webinar could be made available. So I need to make a special advice there. Please do not discuss individual specific cases during the webinar. If you need to do that, I'm sure we can make arrangements for you to discuss it with our presenter after the webinar's concluded. In terms of how we work with the webinars, as you can see, there's quite a lot of you here today. So we're going to ask you to stay on mute while our presentation is going on. And then once the presentation has concluded, we can look at taking questions from everybody. If you have questions during the webinar, please pop them in the chat for us, and we will keep an eye on that. We can either come to them at the appropriate time, or we will make sure that we address them at the end of the session. Okay, so just bear that in mind for us. The reason we ask you to stay on mute is because you're probably aware by now with Zoom that when the microphone jumps to somebody else's background noise, it takes it away from the presenter. So it literally cuts people off mid-sentence. So I do apologise if anybody is unmuted when they come in. I may pop down the list and mute them if it means that it's interfering with Nicola's presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nicola Laird. She is the Bristol LADO. She's going to talk to you about her role, which means she'll probably start by explaining exactly what a LADO is. Nicola, I'm going to hand over to you and I'm going to start the presentation.
Great, thank you, Esther. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many of you. I can't actually see you all as there are too many to put on my screen. So I am going to present to you an overview of the role and responsibilities of the LADO. I'm going to talk about the process of allegations management, and then I'm going to conclude with how professionals and volunteers can protect themselves from allegations being made. Hopefully you will all have or will get a copy of my presentation so you can have a look at that in your own time. And then if at the end there'll be an opportunity for people to ask questions or comments. So it would be really good if you've got any questions to sort of think about those and bring them up at the end. So as Esther pointed out, I am the Bristol Local Authority Designated Officer. So I deal with allegations regarding professionals that work in the Bristol Local Authority area, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But first of all, I'll talk to you about the policy and guidance that relates to allegations management. So as you're probably all aware, Esther, if you don't mind changing the slide. Thank you. Hopefully all of you should be aware of Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018. That is the primary document about multi-agency working that all organisations should adhere to. And within that, there is the requirement for every local authority to have a LADO or team of LADOs to deal with allegations. So in Bristol, we have one LADO, that's myself, and then there is a covering LADO, Richard Lingard, who covers when I'm on leave or absent from the role. I'm based at Bridewell Police Station. I am a qualified social worker employed by Bristol City Council. And as I said, I'm based here at Bridewell along with First Response, who is the front door to children's services that you should have heard of, and also the safeguarding units of the police and a short-term social work team called the Pathway Decision Service. So the next document that I'm just going to mention to you is Keeping Children Safe in Education. So for those of you that work in education, you should all be aware of this. This is your sort of Bible around policies and processes regarding safeguarding issues. And within that is a really useful section on managing allegations. I would recommend that anybody really that works with children should have a look at that, especially the section around managing allegations, because it's really well written. And the process pretty much applies to the process that should happen within other settings. Within education, there is also a document called Use of Reasonable Force, which is published by the Department for Education. Those working in education should know that reasonable force can only be used when a child is at risk to themselves or others. So there's very clear guidance. And the LADO will deal with concerns regarding inappropriate use of restraint, for example, when a child might have sustained an injury. So it's important that those sorts of concerns are referred to the LADO, and usually I will discuss those with the police. A very useful online resource is the South West Child Protection Procedures. If you Google that and then click on the Bristol logo, it will take you into all the child protection procedures related to Bristol, and within that is a section for managing allegations regarding staff. So it's well worth you and your colleagues having a look at that resource. Another very useful document that I think anyone who works with children should look at is the Guidance for Safer Working Practice. So this is a document which outlines the expected behaviour for those people working with children and young people. It is aimed at education, but I think the principles apply to all settings. And I would advise that the code of conduct of organisations should be based around these principles. So the document talks about things like social media contact with children, giving of gifts, physical contact. It's got some very useful examples. So I would really encourage you to have a look at that in the next few days. So following on from that, what is the role of the LADO? So my role is to provide advice and guidance and be involved in the management and oversight of all allegations regarding people that work or volunteer with children. So the LADO doesn't investigate, the LADO receives referrals where there's been an allegation regarding someone that works with children, an allegation of a safeguarding nature, and the LADO will then direct on how the allegation should be investigated. It covers a vast range of different roles. So as you can imagine, there's a huge number of people working in the city who work with children and young people. So that can include scout leaders, football coaches, dinner ladies, school crossing patrol people, foster carers, residential care workers, nursery worker. Any role where someone is having regular contact with children would be called a regulated activity, and that would come under the LADO role. I only deal with allegations regarding people that actually work in the Bristol local authority area. So if, for example, it's a Bristol City Council foster carer who lives in South Gloucestershire, it would be the South Gloucestershire LADO that would deal with that allegation. So just to give you an idea of the number of allegations that I'm receiving a year, on average, I am receiving about 500 contacts. And of those contacts, in the last financial year, the LADO received 160 that met the LADO threshold that required a safeguarding investigation. The majority of those, so 43%, were regarding people who work within education. And that's been the pattern ever since the LADO has been in existence. Education is the highest number of allegations, and that's to be expected because they're the biggest workforce in the city who have the most contact with children. That's followed by allegations about foster carers and residential care workers. And again, that's been the pattern over the last 5 or 6 years. The reason for that, I consider, is because foster carers are having regular contact. The children are living in their home. But in addition to that, children who are in care may have some challenging behaviour, and therefore the carers are at greater risk of allegations being made. So there's a vulnerability there for them. The third category of allegations is regarding early years workers. The LADO does receive a significant number regarding nursery workers and childminders. So that kind of gives you an idea of the kind of figures that the LADO is dealing with every year. So thinking about the principles of allegation management, the LADO has to firstly ensure that all allegations are dealt with as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. So it's as much to protect and ensure that the professional is safeguarded from allegations which aren't substantiated, but with the primary role of safeguarding children. So it's to make sure that professionals who aren't appropriate or suitable to be working in the children's workforce are excluded. but it's also to protect the reputation of the organisation. You're probably aware of a number of high-profile cases that have been in the media about non-recent or historic abuse, for example, within the church, the Football Association, where safeguarding concerns were ignored or sort of brushed aside. Nowadays, within working together, the guidance advises or directs that every organisation that works with children should have a safeguarding policy, and within that policy, it should have a section on managing allegations about staff and professionals that will refer to the LADO in that area. So it's really important that organisations follow that process. So the LADO has to make sure that an investigation is concluded as quickly as possible, because as you can imagine, that's a very stressful process for a staff member to be going through, but also it can have an impact on the organisation if the person, for example, is suspended. And the LADO will monitor the progress of any investigation right until the conclusion of the case and all of the actions are completed. So any allegation that meets the LADO threshold must be investigated. For the high level concerns, it will be dealt with by the police. For concerns that don't meet the criminal threshold, it will be down to the organisation or the employer to do an internal investigation on the lower threshold, the civil threshold, which is the balance of probability. So thinking about the criteria, those of you that work in education are probably aware that Keeping Children Safe in Education was updated this month, and they have added this fourth criteria at the bottom, which I'll talk about in a minute. So within working together, we have the first three criteria for the LADO, for a LADO referral, but the fourth has been added, which I and LADOs in the Southwest and nationally think is really useful. So the first criteria is behaved in a way that has harmed or may have harmed a child. So an example of this is a foster carer who is alleged to have grabbed a child, a looked after child in placement when they're trying to go out of the door. They grabbed them by the clothing and they've caused a mark to their neck where the clothing has caused a burn mark. There, a child has got an injury, and potentially that could go down the route of a criminal investigation. The second criteria is possibly committed a criminal offence against or related to a child. So this could be, and a case I dealt with a few years ago, a nursery worker where a 3-year-old child has alleged that the worker in the setting has touched them on their bottom. That's an allegation of potential sexual abuse, and therefore that would be referred to the police for an investigation. The third criteria is not as specific as an allegation of physical or sexual harm. It could be a pattern of lower level concerns that when you put those together increases the concerns about that individual. So an example of that is a teacher in a primary school where staff had reported a number of concerns about this individual, keeping one specific child back at break time, singling out that child, being quite tactile with them, sitting them on their lap. When you put all of those concerns together, it indicates a potential pattern of grooming type behaviour. What I would advise is that safeguarding leads or managers keep a chronology on a staff member's file if there are a number of concerns that have been reported, so you can look at the pattern that is potentially emerging. And then the fourth category, which has recently been added in Keeping Children Safe in Education, is behaved or may have behaved in a way that indicates that they may not be suitable to work with children. So this relates to issues in the individual's personal life. So it could be concerns in relation to their own child or children, or it could be other issues such as perpetrating violence in their personal life, or looking at indecent images of children and they're subject to police investigation. Clearly that has a transferable risk to their role being in the children's workforce, but I'll talk about that category in a bit more detail in a minute. Okay, this is usually when I'm doing face-to-face training where I like people to interact and sort of call out, sort of test your general knowledge on professionals who've been convicted. So there's a few people here that you might recognise, and I'll go through them quickly. A number of them there's serious case reviews in relation to them online, and I would really encourage you to have a look at some of those. If you're not aware, the NSPCC website has a very useful repository of all the serious case reviews over the last few years. So you can go into those and have a look at ones that maybe relate to your setting. So for example, if you're working in early years, there's ones relating to nursery workers, foster carers, teachers. So just have a look through. There's some very useful learning in these reviews. So three of these actually are local people. The guy at the top right hand side with the glasses is Ashley Yates. He was the head teacher at a primary school in South Gloucestershire, and a few years ago, you might have seen in the press, he was convicted of taking indecent images of children. He had a pen with a hidden camera inside that he left in the toilets. And one day he lost his pen, got very upset and agitated about it. And when it was identified by another staff member, they realised that this was quite an unusual pen and it had the hidden camera inside it. And he'd been taking photographs of children and staff. So he was convicted, served a custodial sentence, has been barred from teaching, and also a DBS referral would have been made for barring with children. Below him, we've got the case of Barry Burnell, who you might have heard of. He was a football coach. A number of years ago, he was convicted of abusing young boys who were wanting to pursue a career in football. He was regarded by the judge as an industrial child abuser. He abused a significant number of young boys, using his power and authority over them to have access to them, allowing them to stay in his house and threatening to jeopardise their career if they didn't go along with the abuse. Below him, we have this is a local lady, Eleanor Wilson. You might have seen her case in the press a few years ago. She was a teacher in South Gloucestershire in a secondary school. She was alleged to have been in a relationship with a male pupil. As you may be aware, it is an offence for a teacher to be in a relationship with a pupil under the age of 18, even though the age of consent is 16. So her case went to court. However, the jury couldn't reach a verdict, and therefore she didn't receive a conviction. However, the school did their own internal investigation, and as there was a large body of evidence of communication between her and this pupil, the school substantiated the allegation, and she was dismissed and has been barred from teaching and working with children as a result. Over to the left, we've got another teacher. There's quite a few here in the southwest. We've got Nigel Leet. He was a teacher in North Somerset who abused children over a significant period of time in a primary school. He abused the children in the classroom in front of pupils and staff. Staff, pupils and parents reported concerns to the head teacher. However, he failed to report the concerns to the local authority or to the police. And as a result, not only was Nigel convicted and he was barred, the head teacher was also barred from working with children as a result of failing to protect the children. In the middle, we have Vanessa George, quite a high-profile case. She abused children in a nursery setting in Plymouth. She was befriended by a paedophile online who persuaded her to abuse the children in the setting and send photographs to him, promising to marry her if she followed through with his requests. It was not that long ago that she was released from prison, so there was quite a lot of furore around her going back into the community. And following her case, and there was a serious case review regarding her, which you can look at online, significant changes were made in nursery settings, for example, regarding nappy changing, because she abused the children while she was changing their nappies in a closed room. Nowadays, nursery settings have to have open areas for nappy changing to protect the children. At the top here, we have a health professional, Miles Bradbury, who is a cancer specialist at Addenbrooke's Hospital, who abused male patients, boys who had cancer. He often abused them in the examination rooms while the parents were on the other side of the screen. So he used his power to abuse very vulnerable children and young people. And finally, this is a Bristol case of Jonathan Thompson Glover. It was a case that I dealt with a few years ago. Jonathan was a teacher and a housemaster at Clifton College, where he taught for about 25 years. And prior to that, he was a pupil at the college. He was identified for his online activity, accessing indecent images of children. And when the police went to have a look at his premises at Clifton College, they discovered hundreds of VHS recordings, and he had installed hidden cameras in the showers and toilets of the college and taken photographs of children, indecent images in various compromising positions. And he was convicted of voyeurism, and he served a short custodial sentence. There is a very interesting investigation report that Clifton commissioned, which is on their website, that I would encourage people to have a look at, because there's some learning from that. I would say the thing that stands out to me, we've got a number of individuals here from a wide range of professions. The thing that stands out from these various cases is that the staff, the colleagues that work with these individuals, were really shocked and horrified that somebody they thought they knew really well that was in their midst could have abused children, and they weren't aware of that. So for me, this is really a lesson about we shouldn't make assumptions. Must really keep an open mind. If an allegation is reported to you, or you have concerns, or staff within your setting have concerns, it's really important that you report those. Okay, so other criteria where the LADO should be notified, I've touched on this already. So if there are concerns about the person's behaviour towards their own child or children that doesn't relate to their employment or work, the LADO needs to be notified. So as LADO, I regularly get referrals from first response. An example of this is where a teenager may have alleged that their parent has assaulted them at home during an argument, and the parent is a teacher in a secondary school, and the case is being referred to a social work unit for an assessment to take place. There is likely to be a transferable risk to that teacher's role, and first response would notify the LADO. Also, the police in their inquiries may come across someone and in their investigation discover that someone who is subject to police investigation works in a position of trust, and they would then automatically refer to the LADO. The other criteria is when there are issues within that person's personal life that may have impacted on their suitability. So, for example, you might have somebody, a nursery worker, for example, who's been out on a Saturday night and assaulted a member of the public when they've had a few too many drinks, and they're subject to police investigation for assault. That would need to come to the LADO because there's a transferable risk to their role working with children. I would encourage you in your settings to just remind staff that it's not just what happens in their work role, but issues within their personal life can have an impact on their role. And the third category is regarding an allegation of abuse that may have taken place some time ago, and the accused person may still be working or having contact with children. As you know, there are quite a few high-profile cases, as I mentioned before, that we've had the case of Jimmy Savile and various other high-profile individuals. That's prompted members of the public to come forward and report concerns of non-recent abuse. So, for example, it might be an adult who was in foster care as a child in Bristol and is alleging sexual abuse when they were younger regarding that carer. So I would be checking in the first instance, is that person still working with children? Because the LADO priority is to make sure that safeguards are put in place whilst that investigation is being progressed. So that kind of gives you a flavour of the kind of referrals that the LADO is dealing with on a regular basis. So next I'm going to talk about the process of managing allegations and what action should be taken and what shouldn't happen. So what should be undertaken when an allegation is reported? Within each of your settings, you should have a policy, as I've mentioned before, and within that it should identify that you have a safeguarding lead, and then any safeguarding concerns should be reported to them or to the manager, whoever is your DSL, designated safeguarding lead. And then so that is the point of contact, and that safeguarding lead should be taking or gaining a written signed statement of the concern or the allegation. And it's really important that this is a factual account, shouldn't make assumptions, shouldn't minimise because the staff member reporting it knows that colleague really well and thinks that they couldn't do it. It has to be very factual and to the point. And also confidentiality should be adhered to in the setting. So staff shouldn't be discussing that with colleagues if they're aware of an allegation. What shouldn't happen, and this does take place from time to time, is that the safeguarding lead, if you go to the next slide, Esther, thank you, is that the safeguarding lead or the manager or the head teacher goes off and does their own investigation, because that could potentially jeopardise a police criminal investigation if that is going to be progressed. It's really important if there's a criminal investigation that any evidence is gained without it being contaminated. So it's really important that before contacting the LADO, the alleged victim or possible witnesses, as well as the perpetrator, should not be interviewed or informed of the allegation. And the parents and carers should not also be informed in the first instance about the allegation being reported. The LADO is the first point of contact, and the LADO will then direct on what actions should take place next. So then once the allegation is reported to the safeguarding lead or manager and they've gathered that information, they will contact the LADO. The LADO works Monday to Friday, office hours. Out of hours, you would contact the emergency duty team. Hopefully you've got those contact details. Once you contact the LADO team, you'll be asked to fill out a LADO referral form, which is on the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership website, or you'll be emailed one. And whoever is on the end of the phone will ask you for information, ask the safeguarding lead for details of that allegation, and then the LADO will be in touch. The LADO will ask the safeguarding lead for details of the allegation, the context of that alleged incident. They'll ask for information about the staff member. So have there been any previous concerns or allegations? And also for information about the child. So do they have a social worker? Are there any concerns about that child or young person? And the LADO will then check their database. So all the referrals that come to the LADO are logged and retained, and the LADO will cross-reference to check if there's been previous allegations reported. And they will also check social care records for the child to check whether or not they've got a social worker. And if the concerns potentially meet the criminal threshold, the LADO will have a discussion, a strategy discussion with the police to determine whether or not they want to progress a criminal investigation. In the discussion with the safeguarding lead or manager, the LADO will advise that the staff member should be supervised while they're subject to an investigation. It's only the manager who can make a decision on whether or not to suspend a staff member whilst they're being investigated. If you work within education, Keeping Children Safe in Education's got the allegation management section has got a few paragraphs around suspension, which is really useful, and I would encourage you to have a look at. Suspension is seen as a neutral act and should also be seen as a last resort. What I will also be discussing is about whether or not there needs to be a LADO sit-down strategy meeting. So if, for example, the staff member works in more than one role with children, they could be a teacher and also a football coach in their spare time, the LADO may decide to have a sit-down meeting to invite the employers or the managers for each setting to that meeting to enable information to be shared and also draw up an action plan of next steps. Once the LADO has all the information, done checks of their system, they will determine whether or not the allegation should be investigated via an internal, the civil investigation, balance of probability, or whether or not the police will be investigating once the police have given advice. The LADO will then direct, in most cases, that the staff member should be notified straight away. Generally, the only time a staff member shouldn't be notified immediately is if the police need to go and seize evidence. So, for example, if there's evidence on phones or electronic devices, they may not want that staff member to know beforehand in the event that they destroy crucial evidence. Parents should be notified that an allegation's been made. And the LADO has, an important part of the LADO role is to ensure that the staff member is provided with support whilst they're subject to an allegation process, investigation process. So the manager will have to identify a named person to support that person whilst they're being investigated. And I will also direct the manager to seek HR advice to notify them that an allegation's been made, and they would guide on the internal investigation process. And once again, I'd stress the importance of confidentiality. So finally, I'm just going to talk about how you and your colleagues can protect themselves against allegations being made. So it's really important that within your setting, you have an open culture where staff can report concerns openly and feel that they're being taken seriously. So I'd encourage you and your staff to report any concerns that you have about staff or colleagues promptly to your line manager or to the safeguarding lead. It's also really important that all staff have regular child protection training and that they have a good working knowledge of child protection procedures, their own code of conduct, so what is appropriate behaviour and what isn't, the organisation's whistleblowing policy, and in addition to that, have a look at the South West Child Protection Procedures. Supervision is another forum or useful opportunity for staff to report lower level concerns that they might have. For example, around a child, if they're worried that they have a vulnerability to an allegation being made, it's really important that staff feel confident in reporting that. And as I said, just that there's a team culture of openness where safeguarding is integral to the running of that setting. And it's not, you don't just have your safeguarding policies there on the shelf or online, but actually it runs throughout your organisation as a thread. And very finally, just thinking about staff conduct, as I sort of talked at the beginning about the importance of staff being clear about what expected behaviours are okay and what isn't, it's important that conduct guidelines are based on safer working practice and linked to the other policies, for example, child protection and whistleblowing, and that staff really know, it's really explicit with staff about what is appropriate and what isn't when working with service users, and that they're challenged and there's a discussion if they breach those boundaries as much to keep themselves safe. Okay, well, that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of the LADO. I appreciate for some of you, it might be quite a lot of new information. I know some of you I have had contact with, so you probably know quite a lot of it. Has anyone got any questions or comments?
What I'm going to do, if it's all right with you, Nicola, is I'm just going to ask Amanda if she can stop the recording, because that way we don't need to worry about what might be discussed at this point being made available outside the meeting space as it